I had mentioned on Sunday that we're going to meet at 6 here for anybody that needs prayer. I want to pray for one another. So just to let you know that we will be here at 6 to pray. And we will be in 1 Kings, and we are in the 10th chapter. So we're looking at 1 Kings chapter 10. And if you remember, in chapter 9, the Lord visits Solomon for the second time and speaks to Solomon. And in that time, he reminded Solomon of what he had said. And then also by way of warning that he needed to follow the command once again and to do those things that he saw in David, who continued to follow the Lord despite David's sin. He never did turn to false gods. He repented, and it cost, and it was something that God dealt with, and there was discipline. But isn't that like any of us? Is when we sin, we repent, and God forgives. And so that was the command to Solomon, that he would follow the Lord's command like his father David. And so when we get to chapter 10 here, I entitled the message, "The Word's Out," and we see Solomon. He gets a visitor, the Queen of Sheba, and so far in Solomon's reign, he's had an amazing reign, and God has moved mightily through him. And God had provided abundantly, and we're going to see, sadly, that Solomon's heart changed towards God. And just to mention, when somebody turns away from the Lord, it is always a heart issue, like we'll see here in Solomon. And so it should be a warning to us. And I know that it's easy to think, well, I've followed the Lord for years and years and years. Surely I'm never going to walk away from the Lord. But we have to realize that, in our lives, it's something to always be on guard for. Because if we're so comfortable that we're no longer on high alert, that's an issue. Because it's a spiritual battle, so we should always be on high alert, not like we're not out of the battle, because the battle's always raging, and so we should always be taking inventory of our life and depending upon the Lord more and more, not less and less, because things get easier. I don't know if you've ever remembered times of huge trials when you felt desperate for the Lord. You were praying more. You were more sensitive. You wanted to hear from the Lord. You were seeking fellowship and all these things because of something you were going through in your life. And I only say that even when you're going through good seasons in your life, still have that desperation to hear from the Lord, talk to the Lord, and to hear from him through his word. And let's remember that there was no one wiser than Solomon. No one wiser, and no one knew more than Solomon, yet Solomon went away from the Lord. And so again, in this chapter 10, we see that he gets a royal visitor. And this royal visitor, verse 1, "Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions." And so the Queen of Sheba, we don't know a lot about the Queen of Sheba. Most would agree that she came from somewhere around where Saudi Arabia is, like south of there. But nobody can be sure. She was a queen, and of course Solomon was a king. But my question when I read that was, why the curiosity? And it tells us there, notice, it was because of the Lord. The Queen of Sheba, she had wealth and she had power, she had prominence, but not the Lord. And so she was hearing a lot of things. And I think this is huge because people can have what you have monetarily, and they can even have much more than you have. But if they hear, notice verse 1, that she heard from a great distance and of the Lord. That word there in the Hebrew means not just a report, but connected to the hearing is obedience and to perceive. And so she heard. As for her, it was like I'm hearing something. I'm believing it's legit. Is the way that she was receiving the information. It's kind of like in James, the first chapter, where it talks about don't just be hearers of the word, but doers. Well, she was hearing in that sense. And she was willing then to do something about all that she could do about what she was hearing. And so, but she needed more detail. She wanted to see it for herself. And so she was invested, and just by the hearing. And so, she could have easily went down the road like, but I'm a queen. I have almost everything, What do I need to go find out about the Lord? There was obviously the Spirit of God ministering into her life, because that's always been the case, to where there was a void recognizable that would put her on a long, long trip. And I think that this should make us aware of the need that people have that is different than what you see concerning certain people. I remember a friend of mine, John Olds. He had a very unique ministry. I know that it's been a while since I shared about him, but he was just a big old 6'6" guy, and he used to be a Costa Mesa policeman. He used to be security down at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, and he's just a big brute of a guy. He's a gentle teddy bear, basically, but he had a ministry where if he saw Christian men that were not doing the right thing, he would get their attention. Because he became a salesman, so he's always like in airports, and he'd run into people, and he'd find out that, a guy says he's a Christian, but he sees them flirting, or he sees them, with another woman or something like that, and he would literally grab him by the shirt, take his Big Mac, and stuff it in his face. And what are you doing, you slime ball? Stuff like that. Unique ministry. That's kind of a rabbit trail, but anyway. But John Olds was just a neat guy, and so he had a friend who was a high-dollar lawyer in Newport Beach, and just dealing with divorce cases of the rich people. So he was always making a lot of money in what he did. And then John just had an urge. He hadn't seen him for a while, so he felt like he needed to share the Lord with him. And so he went and looked him up, went to his house, and after talking to him for a while, he just saw this beautiful house. And he had another house in Europe, and he had so much that he never shared the Lord with him, because he thinks, this guy has so much. Anyway, that following week, his friend wrote a suicide note, and took his life. He says, I've accomplished everything that I wanted to accomplish, and I'm done, and he killed himself. And John was heartbroken, because he really felt like the Lord did put it in his heart to go share with him. And if anything, it was a lesson to him, and he told me, he says, I'll never do that again. And so it was like the same thing. You see somebody, you think, they have their whole life together, but they're searching, and the conversation just never comes around to that. Because usually the pride of life is that I have everything, that's all you need to know about it. Not like, I have everything, but I'm empty, can you help me? Men just, oftentimes won't say that, and yet it'd be true. But here you have the queen of Sheba, and she heard of the fame of Solomon. And so Solomon had this incredible testimony for 20 years as God, was working mightily through him. His reputation preceded him, is a good way to look at that. And it says the fame of Solomon concerning what? The name of the Lord. So that's what she was keyed into. Would be the key word there in that verse, is that what she was concerned with, that key word to this whole account. She was focused on what Solomon knew. She realized the Queen of Sheba's whole purpose was because Solomon had a reputation that he knew God, that he knew him by name, and personally was the idea concerning the name of the Lord. And so it wasn't a theory. And you notice it was not many gods, which would typically be where she was coming from. And you notice it's singular there, the name of the Lord. And so we know Solomon's reputation preceded him, because it tells us in 1 Kings chapter 4, 29 and 30, and God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. And so word had gotten out that was who Solomon was. And so she came, it says, to test him or to prove him with hard questions. Somebody comes and, well, if God is a God of love, why does he allow wickedness in the world? Questions like, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Hard questions, but I'm sure they're a lot harder than that. But anyway, and so she came to test him. Okay, well, let me see about this wisdom of this man Solomon. So I think that what we see here, it's really for the purpose of confirming what she already believed or assumed or suspected. You think about it, that's oftentimes the reason people are saying what they're saying to you. They might put it in a way of like mocking, but really they're looking for a response to a hard question. But most people don't want to treat it as like a serious conversation, but be open to that. And so she, verse 2, came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels, entourage, procession, with camels that bore spices, very much gold, precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. And so she was with a great procession that was with her, bringing a lot of gold. So the procession would have been not only for security's sake, but it would have also been to carry all that she was bringing to King Solomon. And so if you notice, she came all ready to give gifts. And what I'm gathering here is she was excited to meet somebody that she's heard so much about, to find out whether the things that she heard were true or not. And so Solomon, it says, was able to answer all of her questions. And so we have to ask the question why. Why was Solomon able to answer all of her hard questions? Was it because Solomon read every known book there was to man or any of that stuff? No. It was because God downloaded into Solomon supernaturally wisdom and knowledge. He could answer questions that nobody else knew the answers to, because God was giving him supernatural information, and that certainly does not give us any excuses for not studying ourselves. Well, if God could do that for Solomon, why don't he just download all that into my head, or something like that? This was unique, but the Bible tells us in 2 Timothy chapter 2 that we're to study to show ourselves approved unto God, workmen that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And so we're to study, but this is what I did want to bring up. What it does when we read this here is it helps us to understand that the unchanging God that we serve, that we know, through the gifts of the Spirit, can work the same way today, and still does, that he did in the day of Solomon. That's how the gifts work. And I remember when I was just a few years in ministry, it was like the mid-'80s to late 80s, somewhere in there, and I remember I would counsel sometimes, and I would do different ministry functions and helping the pastor. But I remember one time we were using a theater because we had lost our building. We were using a theater, and I remember standing there. One particular time, it was little things, but this particular time, I see this couple walking in, and I distinctly thought, he's cheating on her. And I went, what the heck am I even thinking that for? And I'm thinking, so I shook it off. And it turns out that months down the road, I found out that was exactly what was going on. And so I realized, I started to kind of have a little bit of a heads up that sometimes the Lord just decides to show you something for a reason, to pray. It may be to go talk to somebody. I don't know how the Lord might use it, but it's interesting that sometimes, if you think something that's off the wall, you might pray, is this off the wall, Lord, or is this something you're trying to show me? My cousin years ago was having a battle with headaches, and he had been a young Christian. He just really was a Christian that he had just maybe 2 years, and he was having really bad headaches. And so we prayed for him, and then I woke up one morning, and go tell your cousin to stop using Cremora in his coffee, to use half and half. That's why he's getting his headaches. I went, all right. So I went to him and I said, you're getting your headaches by the Cremora. Use half and half. And he did, his headaches went away. So not only was it teaching me, but also he was a young Christian as well. But I thought, sometimes the Lord just supernaturally heals, and sometimes he just supernaturally gives solutions. But he still works the same way. He's unchanging God. And I think we need to know that because of the gifts of the Spirit. We need to be sensitive, knowing that if we're tracking with the Lord, God could use us in similar ways. So, and also gives us direction to pray confidently about that. So he answers all her questions, and in verse 4, and when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, that could have been his house or the temple, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. It took her breath away. That's what that means there. took her breath away. In modern vernacular, she was blown away, by all that she's seen. And I'd only say that I can imagine that, but it's good to curve all of this thought with something that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, because he mentions Solomon in all his glory in Matthew 6, 28-30. So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now, if God so clothed the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? And so I would only say, okay, I can see her getting her breath taken away by all that she sees in Solomon's glory. But I'd only say to the church, our breath should be taken away by the glory of God and what he does. And that should impress us, because today we see a lot of impressive things, and we shouldn't drool over all that stuff, like it's easy to, got to be careful of. But Jesus kind of, tempered that whole thing. So she first heard by others with her own ears, and then she had to see with her own eyes. And so she's invested here. And then in verse 6, then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceeded the fame of which I heard." And so she came prepared to believe, might be a way to put it. Her suspicions were realized when she came. She wouldn't have came if she wasn't so curious to find out whether these things were true or not. But when the things were told to her, you might have that thought, when somebody tells you something that's too good to be true. No, that's too good to be true. Now, I'd like to mention that that's how the gospel, when you share the gospel, people that don't know the gospel should say, because you hear people say, that's too good to be true, or that's too easy. No. If you call upon the name of the Lord, you shall be saved. And religion tells you you've got to earn your salvation, and you've got to work for it, and you've got to do this or that. But that's not the gospel. The gospel, and when people hear about grace, they say, no, that's too good to be true. Unmerited favor? Wait a minute, I have to earn something here, don't I? And it should hit us the same way. Or we should present it the same exact way, that this is true, and when they hear the true gospel, they should respond in the same way, like she did, seeing all that God did through Solomon. "Happy are your men," she said, "and happy are these your servants, who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom." And so it says a lot to the way that we would communicate. They're hearing Solomon's wisdom, not the foolishness. How often are we guilty of saying the dumbest things that brings down the house in stupidity, or it's a Debbie Downer. I probably shouldn't use Debbie, huh? No, yeah, it's just an expression. I was looking right at you when I said it too. I didn't. Yeah, that's not in my notes, by the way. See, you inspired me, but yeah, okay, thanks. But the things we say, Proverbs 25:11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. we choose our words. And how encouraging when certain people say certain things, you're just like, wow, thank you so much for sharing that. It was uplifting. And then other people, they just can hammer you down from being in a good place to a bad place just by words. Sticks and stones shall break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's not true. Words hit me with a stick, but don't say certain things to me. You know what I mean? I get over the bruise or the stick, but man, the words, they could be long hurting. So what we say, I mean, his men were happy, his servants were happy continually because they heard his wisdom. Blessed be the Lord, your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. Therefore, he made you king to do justice and righteousness. And so this is the setting. And it's incredible. So the Queen of Sheba has been converted and a believer and acknowledging the God over Israel who has appointed Solomon for justice and righteousness. And so this is the perspective, this is the setting, this was going on in Solomon's life that she's acknowledging that they're all happy. But yet later, in Solomon's life, his eyes are no longer on the Lord. And you know what he would say? All this is vanity. That's how he ends. It's all vanity. It tells us in Ecclesiastes, in chapter 1. Where's chapter 1? There it is. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. How opposite his statement is compared to what's being described here. And so once he got away from the Lord, 28 times he says that in the book of Ecclesiastes. 28 times. And so once his heart left the Lord, his perspective was that. And so when our hearts are not tracking with the Lord, then oftentimes our perspective is seeing everything really the opposite of what it is and what it could be or what it had been, because we've walked away from the Lord, which Solomon will do. So now the Queen of Sheba, she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such an abundance of spices as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And so a valuable commodity, salt could be. They used to trade in salt. He's worth his weight in salt, or his pound of salt, or whatever. Salt. If you didn't have salt, you needed salt. Well, they had spices there that she brought that were very valuable, and much gold. So it shows you just how wealthy she was as well. 120 talents is 4.5 tons of gold. 4.5 tons of gold they carried, and if she came from the area where we think she came from was 1,200 miles away with her procession. If you divided 200 pounds of gold per camel, it would take 25 camels just to carry the gold. That's not counting all the spices and everything else. Can a camel carry 200 pounds of gold? Anybody into camels? I don't know. For a while. But 1,200 miles? So this procession, now you kind of get a picture. I mean, this was a big procession, plus all the spices and everything she brought. More than they ever even had there in Jerusalem, she brought. So this was huge. And so in verse 11 also, nope, did I skip something? Verse 10, then she gave verse 11, also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought great quantities of almug wood and precious stone from Ophrah. So they brought wood and precious stones and gold. And so the wealth just was pouring in, saturating Solomon's kingdom, just wealth beyond imagination. And the king made steps of almug wood for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also harps and stringed instruments for singers. There never again came such almug wood, nor has the like been seen to this day. So again, many imports, and so now the King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her according to the royal generosity. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. Now, there's no record of the particulars of what he gave her at all. But both the king of Israel and the queen of Sheba, they basically showered one another with gifts, and these were so prosperous. The times were prosperous for Israel and for King Solomon. And I just think it was very timely that the Lord last chapter showed up and warned Solomon, gave him a heads up. Because now verse 14 and 15, it goes on Solomon's great wealth there. There's more to it here. It says, the weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. So that'd be 25 tons of gold yearly. Besides that, from the traveling merchants, from the income of the traders, from all the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the country. And so that wasn't the only source of his income, his revenue. Apparently there was tributes paid and taxes and everything else. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each one. So they're the big full-size shields, very heavy. He also made 300 shields of hammered gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So they were decorations. And to me, it sounds very gaudy, kind of strange. And not, to me, not a very good idea, a way to spend your money. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps, and the top of the throne was round at the back. There were armrests on either side of the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the armrest. 12 lions stood there on one on each side of the steps. Nothing like this had been made for any other kingdom. And so, that sounded like Solomon was very preoccupied with making things really extravagant. And it just, to me, seems very, very sad. Ivory was not easy to come by. He made a throne out of it, and then he overlaid it with gold. So then he covered it up. And then notice here, so much attention and so much money that was spent on inanimate objects. Not on the people, but on things. And at this point, my guess is that wisdom is slipping already. He's preoccupied with these things. And what's interesting about this, because I know where this is headed, then I would, if I did not know where this was headed, I would probably look for ways of justifying what he's doing here, rather than realizing that this is not a good thing, because he is the wisest man, and because he knows so much, and because God's blessing him with so much of this. But we're going to learn here in a little bit that was God giving him all this, or was this a little bit of his own dealings and his own importing that he was doing? And we find out, yeah, it was. So beware of wanting or working or getting more than the Lord plans on you having. Be sensitive. And I would only say that if you compromise your walk to get something, then that's proof that it's you getting it and not the Lord giving it to you. There's nothing wrong with somebody being rich. That's not the issue. The issue is that is God giving it to you, or are you undermining other people or doing things shrewd to get it? That's what's important. And so all King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. So silver was worthless. And we know it wasn't worthless in other places because it's brought as a gift, and you wouldn't bring something worthless as a gift. But there in Jerusalem, it was. For the king had merchant ships at sea, so this would be the second navy mentioned, with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the merchant ships came bringing gold, silver, ivory, notice apes and monkeys. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And God's not an Indian giver. You heard that expression before? It's like the Lord gives you something and he doesn't take it back. It continues to be yours, but then you have to choose whether you use it for him or not. I think it's so many people with, certain giftings, and they don't even honor the Lord or acknowledge the Lord, and they use their giftings in a worldly way and so forth. But the Lord had gifted them originally. And so here we see that the ivory would indicate that he was in Africa, and I would say the ships every 3.5 years would return, so they went on a big old journey to gather all this stuff for Solomon. And then apes. I don't know why you would want apes. And then monkeys. And so I don't know, when I read that I just thought, Solomon's monkeying around. This is really dumb. Dumb for a wise person. So you could have, what we're going to learn here is you can be the wisest person on earth and do stupid things. You can know a lot and do something you know to be wrong. It almost seems contradictory, but no, it's the fallen nature of man. And so that's why you can have professors in colleges that are very smart that believe in evolution. That's very stupid. But it doesn't matter because they're just blind. They're hoping that something other than God, because they hate the idea of God. They want something in that place. And so we see that it says that God had put this wisdom in his heart. Now, remember, again, we serve an unchanging God. And so this is the Old Testament work of the Lord in the heart of Solomon. What is the New Testament work of the Lord for us? James 1:5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to you. So you lack wisdom? Guess who wants to give you wisdom? Will you ask wholeheartedly? God wants to give you wisdom. And then you could even quote that. Hey, Lord, you know what James wrote, right? Read it. So I want wisdom, Lord. I need wisdom. And then you're praying according to God's will. So In verse 25, each man brought his present articles of silver and gold. There's that silver there. Why bring silver? Well, because wherever they're from, that was a pretty cool thing to bring. Silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules at a set rate year by year. So I don't know whether a tribute or a tax, whatever. And Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king of Jerusalem. And so he started to have a different security system with these. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowland. Also Solomon had horses imported from Egypt and Keva. The king's merchants bought them in Keva at the current price. Now a chariot that was imported from Egypt cost 600 shekels of silver, and a horse 150, and thus through their agents they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. Okay, bad move, Solomon. So now he's taking the money and he's using it to trade in horses and chariots and import trade and all of that. And God spoke very specifically about this 550 years before. In the book of Deuteronomy, it's recorded in Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17, when you come to the land of which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it, and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among you, your brethren. You shall set a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Notice? So Solomon is now the wisest man, all knowledgeable, and doing just what God said not to do, as if he's above the law. And so a wise man once wrote, Solomon, Proverbs 30, 8 and 9, remove falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. A wise man once said that. Solomon wrote that. And so, very sad that Solomon, who is wise and rich and knowledgeable concerning God, his will and his word, would choose instead to love the world. And that's exactly what Solomon did. All this stuff, he began just to love it. I'm sure he loved the attention he was getting. He loved all the stuff. He was surrounding himself more and more with more stuff. And it became Solomon increasing the riches. And the thing is he loved the world and not God. And God left him with free will. So although God gave him all that he gave him, he also left him with free will, like any of us. God leaves us with free will. We have choices to make. And so I don't want to get into this next chapter very much, but in the next chapter, we read in verse 1 through 4, but King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites and the Sidonians and the Hittites. from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. And so, while chapter 10 is kind of fresh in our minds, I wonder how Solomon's choices, after word had gotten out, affected the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba, in the 9th verse of chapter 10, blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. And she left with a completely different impression. And besides her, what about the ripple effects of all of Israel, who we learn follow in his footsteps and become idol worshipers? And he led the way. And so is a testimony, with all the blessings and all the honor and all the wisdom that Solomon was granted. But it says, verse 1, but King Solomon, he had free will, and how did he use that free will? He used it to reject God and his word and his counsel, which he knew very well, had no excuses otherwise. And so Jesus said you can't have it both ways. Jesus said that you can't love the world and then love God also. In 1 John 2:15 through 17, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. The world is passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. Only one can have mastery over your life. What Jesus said in Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one or love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And so here Solomon began to compromise, and then he just went off the deep end completely against the Lord. And so God's word said, surely they will turn your hearts after their gods. And Solomon clung to them. Well, that's the word of the Lord. Surely it will happen. And so Solomon would write another proverb, Proverbs 4:23, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. And he failed to do that as well. And we see and you remember in chapter 9, verse 1, just a page back, where we read before, and it came to pass when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all Solomon's desire which he wanted to do. And it was almost like he came to the end of his rope, fulfilling everything that he wanted to do, and now that should never happen. Our desire every day should be to fulfill the Lord's will. We should never come to the end of the day and says, okay, well, I'm done. I've done everything that I've desired to do. What do I do now? As if there's a void in your life. No. That should have never been expressed as the expression of his heart. So something was fishy up there, and now we see what happens. It was a misled desire of his heart. He had a goal. He finished it, wrapped it up, but it was almost like he was done with that. And then in Deuteronomy, last verse I'm going to read, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. And I always want to say the termites. Every time I read that list, I can't help it. We actually had termites. It was a band, a gang in our high school called the Termites. So every time I read that, I think of that, the termites. But so when they've taken over that nation, the 7 nations greater and mightier than you, so you overthrow them. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show no mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods, so the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire. And it turns out that Solomon began to build these altars to false gods for his wives and begin to worship on them. We'll talk more about that next time. But it's just the idea that that his heart was turned away from the Lord. So be on guard. You should be more on fire for the Lord every day, not bored like Solomon. Christians should never be bored. You know, we should always be serving the Lord and always about his business. And if you're bored, then you need to pray and ask God to give you direction so that you serve him every day. Because you know what? Even if there's in between things, you can always be talking to the God of heaven. Just talking with him, you know, and listening to what he has to say. And not to be bored with it. And it's easy in our day and age, too, to have fewer chores because technology seems to take care of so much more. When people used to have to work from sun up to sundown, not no more. It's like, you know, you can get lazy real easy, right? And so use the wisdom God's given to you. Don't be lazy. Don't be lazy. And you know, parents know how we feel about lazy children. It bums us out. But we also know as parents how we feel about children that are engaged in getting things done. You know, both. And when they're children, you have both. But anyway, it's like that. So we don't want to be the lazy child that the Lord shakes his head at. We want to be engaged. Amen? So Lord, thank you for your word once again, and just help us to grow in our faith, to learn by what we read, to realize that we need to be on guard until we take our last breath here and our first in heaven. You know, we're going to be in a battle, so we know the enemy's trying to always ambush us and set up on us and get us to take our eyes off of you. But I just pray that you fill us with your Spirit, Lord, and help us to serve you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you.